Hey everyone, welcome back. It seems like cybersecurity is on everyone's mind these days, and for good reason, right? I mean, every time you turn around, there's some new threat to worry about.
Yeah, it's a never-ending battle.
Exactly. So today we're diving into a particularly tricky one, supply chain attacks.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, you guys sent in this excerpt from Unraveling the Web, The Rise and Power of Supply Chain Attacks, and I gotta say, it's a real eye-opener. So in this deep dive, we're gonna unpack what exactly these attacks are, why they're so dangerous, and, most importantly, what we can do to protect ourselves against them.
Sounds good.
Did you know that just a single compromised software update, just one, can actually impact thousands of companies?
Yeah, I can see how that could happen. Kind of like a digital domino effect, right?
Exactly. And we'll also get into some real-world examples like the SolarWinds hack, which really shook up the cybersecurity world.
Yeah, that was a big one. It really highlighted how vulnerable we all are.
For sure. So to kick things off, let's talk about why these attacks are becoming so prevalent. The source points to our increasing reliance on all these third-party services as a major factor. Things like cloud storage, payment processing, managing customer relationships, all that stuff.
Absolutely. I mean, think about it. Businesses today rely on this intricate web of external services for pretty much everything, and each connection point, each vendor, becomes an potential entry point for attackers.
Right, so it's like the more interconnected we become, the more vulnerable we become.
Yeah, exactly.
And from a hacker's perspective, it seems like a pretty efficient approach, right? I mean, why just hack one company when you can go after their supplier and potentially get access to hundreds or even thousands of victims downstream?
You got it. It's all about maximizing their impact with the least amount of effort. One successful breach can set off a chain reaction of compromises. It's a pretty scary thought.
Okay, so we've established that these attacks are a big deal and that they're on the rise. But just how bad can they really get? Let's look at the SolarWinds hack as an example, because that really shows just how devastating a supply chain attack can be.
Oh, absolutely. The SolarWinds attack was a masterpiece of, well, I guess you could say malicious ingenuity.
So can you kind of walk us through what happened there?
Sure. Basically, the attackers managed to inject malicious code into a legitimate software update. And this update came from SolarWinds, a company that provides network management tools used by tons of organizations, including government agencies.
Okay, so because it was coming from a trusted source, everyone just installed the update without a second thought, right?
Exactly. They had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. And that's how the attackers gained a backdoor into all these systems.
Wow. So it's like they were hiding in plain sight, using the very tools that were meant to keep us safe against us.
Pretty much. And the scariest part is that they stayed hidden for months, just waiting for the right moment to activate their malware.
Oh, wow. So it wasn't just a quick smash and grab. They were playing the long game.
Yeah, and it really underscores the point that even well-respected vendors can be compromised, and the ripple effects can be massive.
It's a real wake-up call, isn't it? It shows that no one is immune to these attacks.
No one.
The source also mentions NotPetya, which initially looks like a typical ransomware attack, but it turned out to be something much more sinister. Can you tell us about that one?
Oh yeah, NotPetya. That one was nasty. It was disguised as ransomware, but its true purpose wasn't about making money. It was about destruction, pure and simple.
So it was like a wolf in sheep's clothing.
Yeah, exactly. It specifically targeted a Ukrainian software company that provided accounting software. And, get this, they compromised the update mechanism. So when businesses ran their routine updates, they were unknowingly installing NotPetya.
Oh, no.
And it spread like wildfire, crippling systems across the globe.
It's terrifying to think about the chaos that something like that can cause. And it brings us to another important point. The impact of these attacks goes way beyond immediate technical problems.
Oh, absolutely. The fallout from a supply chain attack can be massive. Think about it. It hits you financially, reputationally, legally, operationally. It's a real nightmare.
Yeah, it's like a multi-pronged attack. So let's break those down a little bit. First up, the financial hit. What kind of damage are we talking about here?
Well, first you got the obvious costs, investigating the breach, restoring systems, possibly paying ransoms. But there are also these hidden costs that can be even worse. Lost revenue from downtime, legal fees, regulatory fines. It can be a real financial drain.
I bet. And then there's the whole issue of reputational damage. I mean, having your name splashed across the headlines as the victim of a data breach, especially one that came through a trusted supplier, that can really erode trust.
No kidding. Consumers are really concerned about data privacy these days, and a breach like this can severely damage a company's brand and relationships with its customers. It can take years to rebuild that trust.
Years? Wow. And on top of that, you've got the legal and compliance headaches to deal with.
Oh, yeah. Depending on the industry and what kind of data was compromised, you could be facing huge fines and a ton of scrutiny from regulators. It's a mess.
And then, of course, there's the operational disruption. Losing access to critical systems or data because your provider was compromised. I mean, that can bring a business to a screeching halt.
Totally. It's like having the rug pulled out from under you. And the ripple effects can be felt across every part of the organization. It creates this sense of uncertainty and, well, panic, really.
Okay, so we've painted a pretty grim picture here. These attacks are a real and present danger, and the potential for damage is huge. But let's shift gears now and talk about how these attacks actually happen. How do these attackers manage to infiltrate what it seemed like secure supply chains?
Well, the methods they use can range from these super sophisticated technical exploits to, believe it or not, good old-fashioned human manipulation. It really highlights how cybersecurity is just as much about people as it is about technology.
Yeah, it's like that saying, the weakest link in the chain.
Exactly.
The excerpt outlines 4 main methods that attackers use. Let's start with code tampering and updates. That sounds a lot like the SolarWinds scenario, right?
Yeah, that's a prime example. Attackers sneak malicious code into legitimate software updates. It's like turning those updates into Trojan horses. And since they come from trusted sources, they often bypass all those security checks, which makes them incredibly effective.
It's scary how they can turn our trust against us like that. What about stolen credentials? How does that factor into supply chain attacks?
Stolen credentials are like gold to these guys. Just imagine an employee at one of your suppliers falls for a phishing email, gives up their login information without realizing it. Suddenly, the attacker has access to their systems, and from there, they can potentially get into yours too.
Oh wow, it's a chain reaction. The source also talked about unpatched vulnerabilities.
Right. Think of it like leaving a window open in your house. If your supplier hasn't patched known security flaws, attackers can just waltz right in. It really underscores how important it is to stay on top of those security updates, both for your own organization and for your vendors.
So it's not just about securing your own systems, it's about making sure everyone in your ecosystem is doing their part.
Exactly.
Okay, and then finally, there's social engineering. That one seems like it preys more on human nature than on technical weaknesses.
Oh, absolutely. It's all about manipulation and deception, tricking people into giving up access or revealing sensitive information. Think phishing emails, fake websites, even those cleverly crafted phone calls. They're always coming up with new ways to exploit our trust and helpfulness.
It's crazy how sophisticated they've gotten with those tactics. It's like they're playing mind games with us.
Yeah.
Which is why security awareness training is so important. It gives people the tools they need to recognize those red flags and not fall victim to these scams.
Couldn't agree more. The human element is often the weakest link, but with the right training and awareness, it can actually become a really strong line of defense.
So we've talked about what supply chain attacks are, why they're so dangerous, and how these attackers are carrying them out. But now let's get to the proactive part of the discussion. What can we actually do to mitigate this risk?
Well, the source material outlines several strategies that can really strengthen your defenses against supply chain attack. And I think the most crucial step is really knowing who you're doing business with.
So it starts with due diligence. Don't just assume that a company is secure because they're big or well-known.
Right. It's like doing a background check before you let someone into your circle of trust. You really need to ask those hard-hitting questions about their security protocols, employee training, incident response plans, their track record with data breaches. Don't be shy.
So it's not just about checking a box. It's about truly understanding their approach to security. What are some specific things we should be looking for when we're vetting vendors? What are some red flags that should make us think twice?
Well, you want to dig into their security certifications. Are they compliant with industry standards like ISO 27001 or SOC 2? Do they have a documented security policy? What about an incident response plan?
So it's about looking for evidence that they have a structured approach to security, not just a casual attitude. What else should we be asking about?
Definitely ask about their employee training programs. How do they educate their staff about cybersecurity threats and best practices? Do they conduct regular phishing simulations to test their employees' awareness? Things like that.
Right, because even with the best technology in place, one careless employee can create a huge vulnerability.
That's right. And don't be afraid to ask about their past. Have they had any data breaches? If so, how did they handle them? What steps have they taken to fix things and prevent future incidents?
So transparency and accountability are key.
Absolutely. Now, when it comes to red flags, watch out for vendors who are hesitant to share information about their security practices. Or if they give you vague or evasive answers, that's not a good sign.
It's like they're hiding something.
Could be. And pay attention to their overall security posture. Do they have a dedicated security team? Are they investing in keeping their technology and practices up to date?
So it's about looking for signs that they're taking security seriously, that they're actually putting in the effort to protect their systems and data.
Exactly, because at the end of the day, their security is your security.
Okay, so that's vendor vetting. Now, what about the zero trust model we talked about earlier? How does that actually work, especially when you're dealing with a whole bunch of different vendors and partners?
Yeah, implementing zero trust can seem a little overwhelming at first, but the key is to take it step by step and focus on the core principles.
So don't try to do everything at once.
Right, it's about gradually shifting your security mindset and practices.
What would be a good first step in adopting a zero trust approach?
Well, I'd say start by figuring out what your most critical assets and data are. What information is absolutely essential to your business? Where is it stored? Who has access to it?
So it's about identifying your crown jewels, the information that would be most damaging if it fell into the wrong hands.
Exactly. And once you've got that figured out, you can start implementing some really strict access controls. The principle of least privilege is really important here. Only give users the bare minimum level of access they need to do their jobs.
So no more blanket access or default admin privileges.
Nope. Everyone gets access to only what they absolutely need, nothing more.
I like it. Okay, so what else?
Multi-factor authentication is a must. It adds that extra layer of security. Users have to provide multiple forms of verification before they can access sensitive data.
Makes sense. It's a lot harder for an attacker to get into an account if they need more than just a stolen password.
Right, and this applies to your vendors too. Make sure they're using multi-factor authentication for any accounts that can access your systems or data.
So it's about setting clear expectations and holding your vendors accountable.
Exactly. And finally, in a zero-trust environment, continuous monitoring is absolutely essential. You need to be constantly on the lookout for any signs of suspicious activity and be ready to respond quickly to potential threats.
So it's not a set it and forget it kind of thing. You got to stay active and engaged, always adapting to the changing threat landscape.
Exactly, and that's where threat hunting comes in. It's about proactively searching for any indicators of compromise, even if there are no obvious alarms going off.
That sounds pretty intense. What kind of skills and resources do you need to do threat hunting effectively?
It requires a combination of technical expertise, analytical skills, and a deep understanding of how attackers think and operate.
So it's not something you can just hand off to anyone. It takes specialized knowledge and training.
Definitely, threat hunters need to be able to go through mountains of data, spot subtle anomalies, and connect the dots to uncover hidden threats.
It's like detective work, but in the digital world.
That's a great way to put it. And like any good detective, they need the right tools for the job. That includes security information and event management systems, endpoint detection and response tools, and threat intelligence platforms.
So it's about investing in the technology and the expertise to actively hunt for threats, not just waiting for them to come to you.
Exactly. And that investment can pay off big time in the long run by preventing breaches before they cause major damage.
Okay, so we've talked about zero trust, threat hunting, and vetting your vendors. What about those other technical strategies we mentioned, like segmentation and least privilege? How do those fit into all of this?
Well, segmentation is all about creating barriers within your network to stop an attack from spreading. You're basically compartmentalizing sensitive data and systems so that if one area is breached, the attacker can't easily get to everything else.
Ah, I see. So it's like damage control.
Exactly. By segmenting your network, you're limiting the blast radius of a potential breach. Even if an attacker gets into one segment, they'll have to work a lot harder to move around to other parts of the network.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about least privilege? How does that work?
Least privilege works together with segmentation by limiting the amount of damage an attacker can do, even if they manage to get into a segmented part of the network. Remember, it's all about making sure that every user and every application only has the bare minimum access they need, nothing more.
So it's like layering your defenses, creating multiple roadblocks for the attackers to get through.
Exactly. And remember, least privilege applies to both users and systems. It's about ensuring that everything has only the access it absolutely needs.
Got it. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground on the technical side of things, but let's not forget about the human factor. We talked a little bit about security awareness training earlier, but could you give us more details about what makes for an effective training program?
Sure. A good security awareness training program goes beyond just lecturing people about threats and policies. It has to be engaging, relevant, and practical.
So make it real for people, not just a bunch of abstract concepts and tech jargon.
Exactly. Use real-world examples, case studies, interactive scenarios to show people how these attacks actually happen. Make it relatable.
I like that. Show, don't tell.
Right. And don't just focus on phishing attacks. Cover a wide range of topics: password security, social engineering, best practices for handling data, physical security measures, the whole 9 yards.
So the goal is to create a culture of security awareness, where everyone understands that they have a role to play in protecting sensitive information.
Exactly. And one of the best ways to reinforce good security habits is through those regular phishing simulations.
Yeah, I've heard about those. Do they really work, or do they just annoy people?
When they're done right, phishing simulations can be a really powerful tool. The key is to make them realistic but also educational. If someone falls for a simulated phishing attempt, don't just yell at them. Use it as a chance to give them personalized feedback and reinforce those key lessons.
So turn a potential mistake into a learning opportunity.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to get creative with your training methods. Use gamification, interactive quizzes, maybe even friendly competitions to keep people engaged and motivated.
I like that. Make it fun, right? Make security training something that people look forward to, not just another boring compliance requirement.
Exactly. And remember, security awareness training isn't a one-time thing. It's an ongoing process. You need to reinforce those key messages regularly and keep your training materials updated as new threats and techniques emerge.
So it's about making security a part of the company culture, not just a checklist item.
Right. We talked about the importance of building security into every stage of the software development process, but what does that look like in the real world? What are some key elements of secure development lifecycle?
Well, a good SDL starts with secure coding practices. Developers need to know how to write code that's resistant to common vulnerabilities, things like SQL injection, cross-site scripting, buffer overflows, all those nasty things. So it's about building those security considerations right into the foundation of the software.
That's right. And it's not just about the initial coding ways. Regular code reviews are super important for catching potential vulnerabilities before the software goes live.
So it's about having multiple sets of eyes on the code looking for anything that might have been missed.
Exactly. And then there are automated vulnerability scanning tools that can help find those known vulnerabilities and security flaws that might slip through the cracks.
So using technology to help us do a better job.
Precisely. And don't forget about penetration testing. This is where you simulate real-world attacks to find weaknesses in your systems and applications.
It's like trying to break in before the bad guys do.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. The point is not to prove that your systems are perfect, because they never will be. It's about finding those vulnerabilities and fixing them before someone else can exploit them.
So it's about continuous improvement, always trying to make your defenses stronger.
Exactly. And a secure development lifecycle is an ongoing process. It's not a one and done kind of thing. You've got to constantly adapt your practices to keep up with the changing threat landscape.
So build security into the DNA of your development process. Don't just treat it as an afterthought.
Right. And this goes for both your internal development teams and the third-party vendors you work with.
Okay, so set those expectations and make sure your vendors are following those secure development practices.
Absolutely. And all of these strategies, from vetting vendors to threat hunting to secure development practices, they all contribute to building a more resilient and secure digital ecosystem.
It sounds like there's a lot that organizations can do to protect themselves and their partners. But what about us regular folks? What can we do in our own digital lives to minimize the risks of these supply chain attacks?
That's a great question. And, it often gets overlooked. Organizations have a responsibility to put those strong security measures in place, but individuals have a role to play too. We all have a responsibility to safeguard our own data and systems.
So let's shift gears a bit and talk about some practical tips for individuals to protect themselves in this increasingly interconnected world. Where do we even begin?
Well, first and foremost, you've got to be aware of the risks. Understand that any software you download, any website you visit, any service you use, it could potentially be compromised.
So be mindful of the potential for risk in every digital interaction.
Exactly. And then it's about practicing good cyber hygiene. This includes things like keeping your software up to date, using strong passwords, being cautious about clicking on links or opening attachments from sources you don't know, and watching out for phishing scams.
So those basic security habits we all hear about but don't always practice as diligently as we should.
Right. It's easy to get complacent, but those little things can make a big difference in protecting yourself from attacks.
Okay, so awareness and good cyber hygiene. What else can we do to boost our personal security?
One big one is to enable multi-factor authentication wherever you can. We talked about it earlier for organizations, but it's just as important for individuals.
Right, that extra layer of security can really make a difference in protecting your accounts from unauthorized access.
Absolutely. And don't underestimate the power of staying informed. Keep up with the latest cybersecurity threats and trends. There are tons of great resources out there: blogs, podcasts, newsletters from reputable security experts.
So be proactive, stay ahead of the curve, don't wait for something bad to happen.
Exactly. And finally, don't be afraid to question things. If you get a suspicious email, a weird text message, or a request for information that seems off, Take a moment to verify it before you do anything.
So be skeptical. Don't just take things at face value.
Right, trust your gut. If something feels wrong, it probably is.
So be an active participant in your own security, not just a passive bystander.
Exactly. That mindset, that proactive approach to security is crucial in the world we live in today.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from the technical side of supply chain attacks to the human element. We've looked at the steps organizations and individuals can take to protect themselves. It's a complex and constantly evolving challenge, but it's one we can tackle through awareness, education, and collaboration.
For sure.
So before we jump into specific actions you can take to strengthen your defenses, let's take a quick break. We'll be back in a moment to explore the practical side of safeguarding your supply chain.
Before the break, we were talking about how everyone has a role to play in cybersecurity.
Right, it's not just about companies and organizations. We all need to be aware of the risks.
Exactly. And that kind of leads into the next layer of defense I wanted to talk about, information sharing.
Okay, yeah, we touched on the neighborhood watches idea earlier, being proactive and sharing insights with each other. But how does that actually work in a practical sense?
Well, there are a few key ways this can happen. For one, organizations within the same industry can team up and form alliances or working groups specifically focused on sharing threat intelligence.
I see.
This could involve sharing details about attacks they've seen, vulnerabilities they've discovered, or even just suspicious activity that's popped up on their radar.
So it's about creating that collective defense, pooling resources and knowledge to protect the entire industry.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just individual companies, too. Industry groups can work with government agencies to set stricter security standards and regulations for those vendors and suppliers. Raise the bar for everyone, make it harder for the bad guys to exploit those weak links in the chain.
Right, because a chain is only as strong as its weakest link.
Exactly. And governments also play a crucial role in making sure that information is shared on a larger scale, especially when it comes to things like critical infrastructure or national security threats. They have a broader perspective.
That makes sense. Okay, so we've got industry groups, government agencies. But what about individual companies? What can they do to improve their own security and be a part of this collaborative defense?
One of the most important things is to have strong vendor vetting processes. We talked about this a little earlier, but it's worth emphasizing. Don't just assume that a company is secure because they're big or well-known or because they've been around for a long time. You really have to do your homework.
Right, ask those tough questions. But what are those questions? What should we be asking potential vendors about their security practices? And maybe more importantly, what are some red flags that should set off alarm bells?
Okay, so when you're talking to a potential vendor, you want to really dig into their security certifications. Are they compliant with industry standards? Things like ISO 27001 or SOC2. Do they have a documented security policy and an incident response plan?
So you're looking for evidence that they have a real system in place, not just a winging it kind of approach.
Right. And definitely ask about their employee training programs. How do they educate their staff about cybersecurity? What kind of best practices do they teach? Do they run regular phishing simulations to test their employees? See if they're paying attention.
Because even with the best security technology out there, one careless employee can open the door to all sorts of trouble.
You got it. And don't shy away from asking about their histories. Have they had any data breaches in the past? If so, how did they handle them? What did they learn from it? What did they do to fix things and make sure it doesn't happen again?
So you're looking for transparency and accountability.
Absolutely. Now, some red flags to watch out for. If a vendor is reluctant to share information about their security practices, that's not a good sign. Or if they give you vague or evasive answers, that should raise some eyebrows.
It's like they're trying to hide something.
Yeah, it could be. And pay attention to their security posture. Do they have a dedicated security team? Are they investing in the latest security technologies and practices?
So are they really taking security seriously? Are they putting in the effort?
Right, because their security is your security. It's all connected.
That's a good point. Okay, so we've talked about vendor vetting. Now, what about the zero trust model we discussed earlier? How do you actually implement that, especially when you're dealing with all these different vendors and partners?
Implementing zero trust might seem daunting, but it's really about taking a phased approach and focusing on those core principles.
Okay, so don't try to do everything at once.
Right. It's a gradual shift in how you think about and approach security.
So where would be a good place to start if you're trying to adopt a zero trust approach?
I'd say start by figuring out what your most critical assets and data are. What information is absolutely essential to your business? Where is it stored? Who has access to it? Really think about what would be the most damaging if it fell into the wrong hands.
So it's like identifying those crown jewels, the information you need to protect at all costs.
Exactly. And once you got that figured out, you can start putting some tight controls around access. The principle of least privilege is really important here. Make sure that users only have access to the information they absolutely need to do their job, and nothing more.
So no more just giving everyone access to everything.
Right. No more blanket access or default admin privileges. Everyone gets the bare minimum access. That's it.
Got it. Okay, what else?
Multi-factor authentication is a must. It adds that extra layer of security by requiring users to provide multiple forms of verification before they can access sensitive data.
So it's harder for an attacker to compromise an account if they need more than just a stolen password?
Right. And make sure your vendors are using it too. Any account that has access to your systems or data should have multi-factor authentication enabled.
So it's about setting those expectations and holding your vendors accountable for maintaining good security practices.
Absolutely. And then don't forget about continuous monitoring. In a zero-trust environment, you've got to be constantly watching for any signs of suspicious activity and be ready to respond quickly if something seems off.
So it's not about setting up your defenses and then just forgetting about them. You have to stay active and vigilant.
Right. You have to be constantly adapting to the changing threat landscape, and that's where threat hunting comes in. It's about proactively looking for any signs of compromise, even if there are no obvious alarms going off.
That sounds like a pretty specialized skill set. What does it take to do threat hunting effectively?
Threat hunting takes a special mix of skills. You need technical expertise, you need to be able to analyze data and spot patterns, and you need a deep understanding of how attackers think and work.
So you can't just assign this to anyone. It takes specialized training.
Yeah, you need the right people for the job. Threat hunters need to be able to sift through massive amounts of data, find those subtle anomalies, and connect the knots to uncover hidden threats. It's like being a detective in the digital world.
I like that analogy.
And just like any good detective, they need the right tools. That includes things like security information and event management systems, endpoint detection and response tools, and threat intelligence platforms.
So investing in the right technology is important.
It is, and investing in the expertise. It's about being proactive and hunting for those threats instead of just waiting for them to come to you.
Okay, so we've talked about zero trust, threat hunting, vetting your vendors. What about those other technical strategies like segmentation and least privilege? How do those fit into the picture?
Segmentation is all about creating those barriers within your network. It's like building walls to contain an attack and prevent it from spreading. You're compartmentalizing your data and systems so that if one area gets breached, the attacker can't easily access everything else.
So it's like damage control.
Right. You're limiting the blast radius. Even if they get into one segment of the network, they have to work a lot harder to move around to other parts.
Makes sense. And least privilege.
Least privilege works hand in hand with segmentation. It's about making sure that even if an attacker does get into a part of your network, they can't do that much damage. It's about limiting access so that every user and every application only has access to what they absolutely need to do their job.
So you're creating multiple layers of defense, making it harder for attackers to move around and do damage.
Exactly. It's about making their lives as difficult as possible. And remember, least privilege applies to both users and systems. Everyone and everything should only have the access they absolutely need. That's it. No more, no less.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground on the technical side, but what about the human element? We talked about security awareness training earlier, but what are some specific things that make for an effective training program?
A really effective security awareness training program goes beyond just lecturing people about threats and policies. It's about making it real for them, make it engaging, relevant, and practical.
So no more boring PowerPoint presentations.
Right. Use real-world examples, case studies, interactive scenarios. Show people how these attacks happen, not just tell them. Make it relatable.
I like that.
And cover a wide range of topics. Don't just focus on phishing attacks. Talk about password security, social engineering, best practices for handling data, physical security measures. Give them the whole picture.
So the goal is to create this culture where everyone understands that security is everyone's responsibility.
Exactly. And one of the most effective ways to reinforce good security habits is to run those regular phishing simulations.
Yeah, I was wondering about those. Are they actually effective, or do they just annoy people?
If you do them right, phishing simulations can be a really powerful tool. Make them realistic, but also make them educational. If someone clicks on a simulated phishing link, don't just scold them. Use it as a chance to teach them. Give them some personalized feedback and reinforce those key lessons.
Turn it into a learning experience.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to think outside the box when it comes to your training methods. Use gamification, quizzes, even friendly competitions. Make it fun.
I like that. Make security training something people actually want to do, not just another boring compliance thing they have to check off their list.
Exactly. And remember, security awareness training isn't a one-and-done deal. It's got to be an ongoing thing. You've got to keep reinforcing those key messages and updating your training materials to keep up with the latest threats and techniques.
So it's about making security a core part of your company culture.
You got it. And that brings us to another really important aspect of supply chain security, secure development practices.
Right? Building security into every stage of the software development process. But what does that actually look like in practice?
Well, a strong secure development lifecycle starts with secure coding practices. Your developers need to know how to write code that can withstand those common attacks, like SQL injection, cross-site scripting, buffer overflows, all that nasty stuff.
So you're building security right into the foundation of the software.
Exactly. And it's not just about that initial coding phase either. Regular code reviews are critical for catching those vulnerabilities before the software is released.
So having multiple sets of eyes on the code looking for anything that might have slipped through.
Right, and those automated vulnerability scanning tools can help too. They can identify known vulnerabilities that someone might have missed.
So technology can help augment those human checks and balances.
Exactly. And penetration testing. Don't forget about that.
Remind me, what was that again?
It's where you simulate a real-world attack to try and find weaknesses in your systems and applications.
Oh, right. So basically you're trying to hack into your own systems before the bad guys do.
Pretty much. The point is to find those weaknesses and fix them before they can be exploited. You're never going to have a perfect system, but you can make it as secure as possible.
So it's all about continuous improvement.
Exactly. And remember, a secure development lifecycle isn't a one-time project. It's an ongoing process. You need to constantly be adapting your practices as the threat landscape changes.
So it's like that saying, the only constant is change.
Exactly. And this applies to your own development teams as well as the third-party vendors you work with. Make sure they're on board with these practices.
So set those expectations and hold your vendors accountable.
Exactly. All of these strategies, from vetting vendors to threat hunting to secure development practices, they all work together to create a more secure digital ecosystem.
Okay, so it sounds like there's a lot that your organizations can do. But what about the individual? What steps can people take in their own digital lives to minimize the risks from these supply chain attacks?
You know, that's a great question. It's easy to think that it's all up to the big companies and organizations to protect us, but individuals have a role to play too. We all do.
So what can we do? Where do we even start?
Well, first of all, be aware of the risks. Understand that any software you download, any website you visit, any online service you use, all of it could potentially be compromised.
So be mindful, be aware that there's a potential for risk everywhere you go online.
Exactly. And practice good cyber hygiene. Keep your software up to date. Use strong, unique passwords. Be careful about clicking on links or opening attachments from senders you don't recognize. And be on the lookout for phishing scams.
So it's all those basic security habits we hear about all the time.
Right, but those basics really do make a difference.
Okay, so awareness and good cyber hygiene. What else can individuals do to protect themselves?
Enable multi-factor authentication wherever possible. We talked about this before for organizations, but it's just as crucial for your personal accounts.
Right, that extra layer of security can really help.
It can. And stay informed, keep up with the latest cybersecurity threats and trends. There are lots of great resources online, blogs, podcasts, newsletters from reputable security experts.
So stay curious, stay informed.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to question things. If something seems off, an email, a text message, a request for information, don't be afraid to double check it before you do anything.
So be a little skeptical. Don't just blindly trust everything.
Exactly. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Trust your instincts.
So be an active participant in your own security, not just a passive bystander.
Exactly. That mindset, that proactive approach is really important these days.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the technical aspects of supply chain attacks, the human element, and what we can do to protect ourselves. It's complicated, and it's constantly evolving. But we can tackle this challenge with awareness, education, and collaboration. We've really dug deep into how these attacks work and the layers of defense we need to have in place. But honestly, if I was listening to all this, I think I might be feeling a little overwhelmed. It's a lot to take in. Where do you even begin with something this complex?
Yeah, I can see that. It's easy to get lost in all the technical stuff and feel like you're always trying to catch up to the latest threat. But I think the most important thing is to remember that cybersecurity is about more than just technology. It's about mindset.
Okay, I like that. And what do you mean by a cybersecurity mindset?
It's about having that healthy skepticism, being aware of the potential risks in every digital interaction, and constantly questioning assumptions. Don't just take things at face value.
So be proactive and engaged, not just passive.
Exactly. And this goes for everything. Clicking a link in an email, downloading a new app, choosing a vendor for your business. Don't just trust blindly. Take a second to think about the risks and make informed decisions.
So it's about switching from a reactive mode to a proactive mode. Always thinking one step ahead.
Right. And a big part of this mindset is understanding that security is a shared responsibility. It's not just the IT department's problem, it's everyone's job to protect sensitive information.
So create that culture of awareness. Everyone feels comfortable speaking up if they see something suspicious or if something seems risky.
Absolutely. And this awareness goes beyond just the workplace. Be mindful of your digital footprint everywhere you go online.
So good cyber hygiene at work, at home, on social media, everywhere.
Yep. The lines are blurred these days between our personal and professional lives, and that goes for the cybersecurity risks, too.
That's a good point. So we've got mindset, awareness, shared responsibility. Any other big principles that we should be thinking about as we navigate all of this?
One that comes to mind, especially when we're talking about supply chain attacks, is defense in depth.
Okay, yeah, I've heard that term before, but can you break it down for us? What does it actually mean?
It means that you can't rely on just one security measure. There's no magic bullet that's going to stop every attack. You need layers of defense, like a castle with multiple walls and a moat.
So even if one layer fails, the attacker still has to get through all the others.
Exactly. And those layers can be anything. Technical safeguards like firewalls and intrusion detection systems, organizational policies, security awareness training, strong passwords. It's about covering all your bases.
So a holistic approach to security.
Right. And defense in depth isn't just about stopping attacks. It's also about minimizing the damage if someone does get through.
So being prepared for that worst case scenario.
Exactly. And that kind of leads into another important principle, resilience.
Okay, so resilience is about bouncing back, right? But how does that apply to cybersecurity specifically?
In cybersecurity, resilience is about building systems and processes that can handle attacks. That means you can recover quickly and adapt to the ever-changing threat landscape.
So you accept that breaches might happen, and you focus on minimizing the damage and getting back on your feet quickly.
Right. And a big part of resilience is having a good incident response plan.
So if an attack happens, you know exactly what to do. You have a process in place to contain the damage, investigate what happened, and recover your systems and data.
Exactly. And you need to test that plan, update it, make sure it actually works when you need it.
So it's a living document, not just something that sits on a shelf gathering dust.
Right. Which brings us back to that idea of continuous improvement. Cybersecurity is not a destination. It's a journey. You got to be constantly learning, adapting, evolving to stay one step ahead.
Always be learning.
And that leads me to the last thought I want to leave our listeners with. One of the most powerful weapons we have in this fight against cyber threats is critical thinking.
I love that you said that. We've talked about all these strategies and tactics and tools, but at the end of the day, it comes down to making good decisions.
Exactly. We are bombarded with information all day long. Links, downloads, requests. It's easy to just click, click, click without really thinking about what we're doing.
We go on autopilot.
And that's what the attackers are counting on. They want us to be complacent, to trust without question. So the next time you're about to click on something, download a file, give someone access to your system, stop, take a breath, think.
Ask yourself, do I know where this came from? Should I be doing this? What could happen if something goes wrong?
Those few seconds of thinking can make a world of difference. Be aware, be informed, be proactive.
Love it. Cybersecurity isn't just about technology, it's about how we think. It's about being vigilant, being skeptical, being empowered to make those smart choices.
And that's a message we can all take to heart at work, in our personal lives, wherever we go online.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of supply chain attacks, here's the challenge for everyone listening. What can you do right now to strengthen your own supply chain? Maybe it's at your company, maybe it's in your own personal digital life. What steps can you take?
It might seem overwhelming, but remember, every little thing you do, every bit of knowledge you gain makes a difference. We're all in this together, and if we work together, we can make the digital world a safer place for everyone.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Stay curious, stay informed, and stay safe out there. We'll see you on our next deep dive.